They say you never truly know the weight of a memory until you're standing in the dust of it, breathing in the pulverized drywall and splintered cedar that used to be the only place on earth where you could still hear your dead wife's laugh. I'm standing there, shoes coated in gray powder, looking at a jagged hole in the earth, where the glass area used to stand. That's what Elena called it, her masterpiece, the house she designed on napkins in the chemo ward. While the drip ticked away the seconds of her life, and all I can smell is diesel fuel and the metallic tang of betrayal. It was a Tuesday for God's sake, and while I was 300 miles away in the state capitol, raising my right hand to be sworn in as the new state attorney general, a woman named Patricia van der Hoven was directing a bulldozer through my living room because I allegedly owed $4,000 in unpaid HOA fines. Let me back up, because if you don't understand Patricia, you don't understand the sheer, unadulterated madness of suburban tyranny. Patricia was the president of the Silver Creek Ridge Homeowners Association, a title she wore like a five-star general's uniform, complete with a terrifyingly stiff blonde bob that didn't move in the wind and eyes that looked like they were scanning your soul for code violations. She drove a pristine white Range Rover that never saw a speck of mud, patrolling the cul-de-sacs at crawling speeds, writing down license plate numbers of visiting contractors, and measuring grass height with a literal ruler she kept in her glove box. I'm not exaggerating. I once saw her on her hands and knees in the rain, measuring the distance between a neighbor's mailbox and the curb, because she suspected it was off by half an inch. When I bought the double lot at the top of the ridge, I was just a grieving widower, a former prosecutor trying to disappear into the woods and build the sanctuary Elena never got to live in. It took me 3 years to build it. Sustainable timber, floor-to-ceiling glass facing the valley, a cantilevered deck that felt like you were floating. It wasn't a mansion to show off. It was a love letter written in architecture. And for the first 6 months, it was quiet. I paid my dues. I kept my head down. I waved at neighbors. But then came the paint incident. Elena had specified a particular shade of slate gray for the exterior trim, storm cloud. She called it to blend with the granite cliffs. I painted it. 2 days later, there's a note on my door, typed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, signed with a flourishing P. Dear Mr. Thorne, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, storm cloud is not on the approved palette of 14 shades of beige. Please remediate immediately to avoid penalties. I ignored it. I was a lawyer. I knew the bylaws better than she did, and the bylaws stated clearly that earth tones were acceptable, and last time I checked, slate was part of the earth. That was my first mistake, thinking logic applied to Patricia. She didn't want compliance. She wanted submission. Over the next year, the fines started trickling in like a slow leak in a basement, rotting everything from the foundation up. Fines for unauthorized bird feeders. Fines for my truck being parked in the driveway for more than 2 hours. Fines for light pollution because my motion sensor triggered when a deer walked by. I paid them. I paid every single one, writing checks with a shaking hand, not out of fear, but because I just wanted to be left alone to mourn. I kept the receipts in a fireproof box in the study. A habit from my days prosecuting fraud cases, always keep the paper trail. But then I decided to run for office. The campaign was brutal, dirty, and exhausting, and my opponent tried to paint me as an elitist living in a mountain fortress, a narrative that curiously started appearing in local blogs that no one read, blogs that I later found out were run by Patricia's nephew. I won, barely, but I won, and I think that's what broke her. The idea that the man she was fining for excessive mulch usage was about to become the chief law enforcement officer of the state was an insult to her localized, absolute power. 3 days ago, I left for the Capitol. I secured the house, set the alarm, and drove off. At 7:15 a.m. yesterday, while I was prepping my acceptance speech, Patricia convened an emergency executive session of the HOA board. There are 5 members, but she only invited to her husband, Buck, a man whose neck was wider than his head and who looked at neighbors the way a bouncer looks at drunks, and Janice, a terrified elderly woman who voted yes on everything, just so Patricia wouldn't measure her rose bushes. They voted to foreclose on my property for delinquent assessments and, citing a rarely used clause about immediate structural hazards, authorized a demolition order. A hazard, my house, a marvel of modern engineering, declared a hazard because, according to their minutes, the unapproved paint color compromised the aesthetic integrity of the hillside, creating a psychological blight. I got the call from my neighbor, Heavyset Dave, a retired plumber who hated Patricia with the fire of 1,000 suns. Julian, he shouted into the phone, and I could hear the roar of engines in the background. You gotta get home, man. They're tearing it down. They're tearing the whole damn thing down. I thought he was joking, or maybe a tree had fallen. I drove 90 miles an hour, flashing lights illegally used, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. When I pulled up the driveway, the dust was already settling. The excavator was sitting on top of where the master bedroom used to be the room, where I kept Elena's ashes. Patricia was standing by her Range Rover, arms crossed, wearing a floral scarf that fluttered in the mountain breeze, watching the destruction with a look of serene satisfaction. I got out of the car, my legs feeling like lead, and walked toward her. Buck stepped in front of me, hand on his belt like he was reaching for a piece, chest puffed out. Property is under HOA control, Mr. Thorne, he grunted. You're trespassing. I didn't look at him. I looked at her. Patricia, I said, my voice sounding strange, hollow, like it was coming from someone else. Tell me you didn't just destroy a $2 million home over paint. She smiled a tight, thin smile that didn't show teeth. It wasn't just the paint, Julian. It was the disrespect, the accumulation of violations. We have standards. If we let you slide, the whole community collapses into anarchy. We sent you the notices. You didn't respond. I paid them, I whispered. I paid every dime. Our records show otherwise, she said, checking her manicure. And since you missed the emergency hearing this morning, which was posted on the clubhouse bulletin board at 6 a.m., per the bylaws the board acted in the best interest of the association. It's done. The lien is foreclosed. The blight is removed. I looked at the pile of rubble. I saw a piece of the blue tile from the kitchen, a shard of the stained glass Elena had designed. I felt a rage so cold it burned, a white-hot clarity that usually only comes right before you pull the trigger or drop the gavel. I realized then that this wasn't about fines. This wasn't about the HOA. This was a hit. A clumsy, arrogant, small-town hit designed to break me before I could take office. Or maybe just because she hated that I existed outside her control. You better hope, I said, stepping closer, ignoring Buck's twitching muscle, that you did everything by the book, Patricia. You better hope there isn't a single comma out of place in those bylaws. I wrote the bylaws. She sneered. Now get off my sight before I have the sheriff arrest the attorney general for trespassing. I walked away. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a punch. I got in my car, drove to the Motel 6 at the bottom of the hill, and set up a war room. I called my chief investigator, a woman named Sarah who could find a needle in a haystack if the haystack was digital and encrypted. Sarah, I said, I need everything on Patricia van der Hoven. I need her bank accounts, her husband's military records, the whole financials for the last 10 years. And I need to know who owns the demolition company that just flattened my life. It took Sarah for hours. That's the thing about petty tyrants, they think they're geniuses. Because nobody has ever bothered to actually check their math. They rule by fear and exhaustion, banking on the fact that people have jobs and lives and can't spend 40 hours a week fighting over a trash can violation. But I didn't have a house anymore. I had nothing but time. What Sarah found was the first thread of a sweater that, once pulled, would leave Patricia naked in the freezing cold. The demolition company, Ridgeline Services, wasn't a licensed contractor. It was an LLC registered in Nevada 3 weeks ago. The registered agent, a shell corporation, but the mailing address, a P.O. box in a strip mall 3 towns over. And who else rented a box in that same strip mall? Buck's security consulting firm. I went back to the site that night. The moon was full, illuminating the wreckage like a crime scene, which it was. I climbed over the caution tape. I needed to find the box, the fireproof box. It was in the study, under the floorboards, a secret Elena and I had shared, a time capsule spot. If the excavator had dug deep, it was gone. If they had just crushed the structure, it might still be there. I dug with my bare hands, moving splintered beams and shattered drywall, coughing in the dust, until my fingers brushed cold steel. It was dented, scratched, and buried under 1,000 pounds of debris, but it was there. I dragged it to the motel. I pried it open with a tire iron. Inside, perfectly preserved, were the receipts. But not just the receipts, the canceled checks. And on the back of every canceled check, the endorsement stamp. It wasn't the HOA's bank account. It was a stamp that read PVDH Holdings, Patricia van der Hoven Holdings. She hadn't been depositing the fines into the HOA reserve. She had been stealing them. Stealing everything. For years. And if she did it to me, she did it to everyone. But I couldn't just arrest her. That would look like retaliation. The Newegg arresting the woman who destroyed his house. The press would have a field day. Abuse of power, they'd scream. No, I had to be smarter. I had to make the community take her down. I had to make her people turn on her. I spent the next 2 days interviewing neighbors. I didn't go as the ag. I went as the guy who lost his wife's house. I knocked on Dave's door first. He invited me in, gave me a beer, and I showed him the check. His eyes went wide. I paid her $6,000 last year for a roof pitch violation, he whispered. She said the contractor had to be paid in cash. Did you get a receipt? I asked. Handwritten, he said. We went to the elderly widow, Mrs. Higgins, the one whose rose bushes were always being measured. She was terrified to open the door until she saw it was me. She sat me down in her kitchen, hands shaking. She told me she'd put a lien on my house if I didn't pay the view tax, she said, wiping a tear. $200 a month because I can see the mountain. Is that real, Mr. Thorne? No, Mrs. Higgins, I said gently, holding her hand. That's extortion. By Friday, I had 18 affidavits, 18 neighbors, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fake fines, phantom assessments, and kickbacks from approved vendors that were all owned by Patricia's cousins, or Buck's Army buddies. It was a racketeering enterprise disguised as a neighborhood watch. But the coup de grace, the thing that was going to bury her, wasn't the money, it was the land. Sarah dug up the original surveyor's maps from 1980, the common area where Patricia had built her private gazebo, the spot where she held her court and looked down on us peasants. It wasn't common area. It was actually part of a protected wetland buffer, and the land my house sat on. When she demolished it, she disturbed a dormant asbestos layer from an old mining structure that predated the subdivision, something noted in the environmental report she would have seen if she had actually filed for a legal demolition permit. By tearing down my house without a remediation team, she hadn't just committed fraud. She had committed a federal environmental crime that carried a mandatory prison sentence. I needed a stage. I needed a moment where she couldn't hide behind her email or her husband. The quarterly HOA town hall was scheduled for Saturday night. It was usually a sleepy affair where Patricia droned on about mulch for 2 hours. I called Dave. I need you to get everyone there, I said. Fill the room. Tell them I found something. You gonna arrest her? Dave asked, sounding hopeful. Better, I said. I'm going to let her speak. Saturday night arrived. The community center was packed. I'm talking standing room only. People were buzzing, whispering. Patricia sat at the head table, flanked by Buck and Janice. She looked nervous. She'd seen my truck in driveways. She knew I was up to something. But her arrogance wouldn't let her believe she could lose. She tapped the microphone. That screeching feedback sound cutting through the room. Order, she barked. I call this meeting to order. I see we have a large turnout. I assume this is about the unfortunate remediation of the Thorne property. Let me be clear, the board followed all protocols. Mr. Thorne was a delinquent owner who refused to comply with aesthetic standards. We protected your property values. Liar, someone shouted from the back. It was Mrs. Higgins. Patricia blinked, stunned. Mrs. Higgins never spoke above a whisper. Excuse me, Patricia snapped. You are out of order, Janice. Write her down for a disruption fine. No, Janice said. The room went silent. Janice, the mouse, put her pen down. I'm not writing anything down, Patty. I'm done. Patricia turned purple. Buck, remove her. Buck stood up, his chair scraping loudly. That was my cue. I walked in from the back doors, not alone. I had the county sheriff with me, and to federal agents, from the EPA who were very interested in the asbestos dust currently coating the trees downwind of my lot. "Sit down, Buck," I said, my voice calm, carrying across the room without a microphone. "You have no business here," Patricia shrieked, standing up. "This is a private meeting, actually," I said, walking down the center aisle, holding the battered fireproof box like a shield. "It's a crime scene, and I'm not here as the Attorney General, Patricia. I'm here as the victim of a grand larceny scheme you've been running since 2018. I reached the front. I dumped the box onto the table. Dust and ash spilled out with the papers. 18 homeowners, I said, pointing to the crowd. $300,000 in fines. And here, I held up the copy of the check with her holding company stamp. Double quotes. Is where the money went. It didn't go to the reserve. It went to your vacation home in Cabo. The crowd gasped. It was that movie gasp, the kind you think is fake until you hear it. That's a forgery," she stammered, sweat breaking through her foundation. "And the demolition," I continued, turning to the audience. "She authorized it to cover her tracks because she knew. She knew that once I took office, I'd see the books. She destroyed my wife's dream to save her own skin. But she missed one thing." I motioned to the EPA agents. One of them stepped forward. A tall guy with a badge that shone under the fluorescent lights. "Mrs. van der Hoven," he said. "Did you authorize the demolition at 440 Ridge Road without an environmental impact survey?" "The bylaws," she sputtered. "Federal law trumps your bylaws, ma'am," the agent said. "You released a known carcinogen into a residential area. That's a felony per day of exposure." Patricia slumped into her chair. She looked small. All the air, all the pomp, all the general of the suburbs' energy just evaporated. She looked at Buck. Buck looked at the sheriff, looked at the exit, and then sat back down, crossing his arms. He wasn't going down for her. The sheriff stepped forward. "Patricia van der Hoven, please stand up." As they cuffed her, the room didn't cheer. It was eerie. They just watched. It was the heavy silence of people realizing they had been bullied by a phantom for years. They watched her get walked out, the click-clack of her heels on the linoleum sounding like a ticking clock that had finally stopped. I looked at the neighbors. I saw relief, yes, but I also saw shame. Shame that they had let it happen. Shame that it took a destroyed house to wake them up. Shame that it took a destroyed house to wake them up. And honestly, standing there with the dust of my wife's legacy still under my fingernails, I felt it too. It's a seductive thing, apathy. It's easier to pay the $50 fine for the improper mailbox shade than to stand up and ask why the hell the mailbox shade matters in the first place. We all bought into her little kingdom because we just wanted to live our lives, and in doing so, we handed her the keys to the bulldozer. The days following the arrest were a blur of depositions and forensic accountants tearing through the HOAS books like termites. The scale of it was staggering. Patricia hadn't just been skimming. She was practically looting. The reserve fund for road repairs, empty, the insurance premiums, unpaid for 6 months. If a wildfire had swept through Silver Creek last week, none of us would have been covered. She had gambled it all on a condo development scheme in Arizona that went bust, and she was using our fines to plug the holes in her sinking ship. Buck flipped on her in less than an hour. Turns out, the tough guy loyalty expires the moment federal charges for wire fraud hit the table. He gave up the passwords, the offshore accounts, and the location of the storage unit where they kept the real books. He claimed he was just following orders, a soldier in his wife's war. But the judge didn't buy it, especially when they found 40 grand in cash, stuffed inside his hunting gear. But for me, the legal victory felt hollow. I was the Attorney General now. I had the power to crush her in court, to ensure she spent the next 10 years in a federal facility making license plates, instead of HOA rules. But every evening, I drove back to the ridge, parked my truck, and sat on the tailgate staring at the hole in the ground. The wind howled through the gap where the living room used to be. The ghosts of the house were gone, exorcised by the violence of the demolition. One evening, about a week after the arrest, Dave drove up. He got out of his truck, looking uncomfortable. He was holding a rolled-up piece of paper. "Hey, Julian," he said, kicking a piece of gravel. "You doing okay?" "I'm surviving, Dave," I said. Just trying to figure out what to do with the lot. Can't build on it for a while. The EPA cleanup is going to take months. Dave nodded. Yeah, about that. The neighbors. We had a meeting. A real one. No minutes, no fines. He unrolled the paper. It was a crude drawing, but I recognized the layout. It was my lot, but instead of a house, there were paths, benches, and a pavilion. We know we can't bring the house back, Dave said, his voice thick. And we know Elena. We know she loved this view. Mrs. Higgins suggested it. We want to buy the remediation debt. We want to turn the lot into a community park. The Elena Thorne Memorial Overlook. If you're willing to sell the land to the association. The new association. I looked at the drawing. I looked at Dave, this big, rough-handed man who had been terrified of a woman with a ruler a week ago. Now standing here offering me a way out. I don't want the money, Dave, I said. We know, he said. But we owe you. We let her do this. We watched her pick you apart, and we didn't say a word because we were glad it wasn't us. That's on us, Julian. Let us fix it. I sold them the land for $1. The next 6 months were the hardest of my life. Not because of the case Patricia pleaded guilty to avoid a public trial. That would have humiliated her further, but because I had to learn to live without the anger. The anger had been a fuel, burning hot and bright, keeping me moving. Without it, I just missed my wife. But something started happening in Silver Creek. With Patricia gone, the fear evaporated. People painted their doors bright red and blue. They planted wildflowers instead of manicured turf. They parked their trucks in their driveways and left them there all weekend. The community didn't collapse into anarchy like Patricia predicted. It blossomed. It became a neighborhood. I bought a small cabin on the other side of the mountain. A fixer-upper with good bones. No HOA. I spent my weekends sanding floors and listening to the radio. Far away from the politics of the capital. One Saturday, I drove back to Silver Creek for the dedication of the park. It was beautiful. They had used the reclaimed timber from my wrecked house, the pieces that weren't contaminated, to build the pavilion. The view was exactly as Elena had framed it in her mind. There was a plaque on a large granite stone for Elena, who dreamed of this view, and for the community that learned to see it. I was standing there, tracing the letters on the plaque, when a woman approached me. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair loose and graying. It took me a moment to realize it was Janice, the board member who had finally said no. Mr. Thorne, she said softly. It's beautiful. It is, Janice, I agreed. I wanted to tell you, she said, looking at her shoes. I visited Patty yesterday. In the facility, I stiffened. How is she? She's angry, Janice said. She complains about the food, the uniforms, the schedule. She's trying to organize the other inmates to petition for better pillows. She hasn't changed. She thinks she's the victim. She told me that you ruined her life because you couldn't follow simple rules. I laughed, a dry, short sound. She would, but here's the thing. Janice looked up at me, her eyes clear. She's alone. She has her rules, but she has no one. You have this. She swept her hand across the park, where kids were playing tag on the grass and neighbors were sharing a potluck picnic on the benches. You lost the house, Julian, but you won the war, and you didn't become her to do it. I drove home that night thinking about what Janice said. Did I win? I destroyed a woman's life, sure. She deserved it. She was a criminal and a bully. But I used the full weight of the legal system to crush her. I felt a twinge of guilt, that old Catholic guilt that says turning the other cheek is noble. But then I remembered the sound of the bulldozer. I remembered Mrs. Higgins crying in her kitchen. I remembered the text from Dave saying he was afraid to park his own truck in his own driveway. Sometimes, turning the other cheek just exposes your neck to the wolf. I sat on the porch of my new cabin, watching the sun dip below the ridge. I opened a beer and toasted the empty air. To the glass airy, I whispered, the question I wrestle with now. And the reason I'm telling you this story isn't about hose or corrupt boards. It's about power. Patricia had a little bit of power, and she used it to strangle the world around her, to make herself feel big. I had a lot of power, the Attorney General's office, the FBI, the law, and I used it to destroy her. Was it justice? Absolutely. She broke the law. She hurt people, but was there a part of me, a dark, jagged part deep down, that enjoyed watching the handcuffs click? That enjoyed seeing the fear in her eyes when she realized she wasn't the biggest predator in the woods anymore? Yeah, there was. And that scares me more than Patricia ever did, because the line between a righteous crusader and a tyrant is thinner than we think. It's painted in the same shade of gray as my unapproved exterior trim. So, you tell me, when you deal with a bully, with a tyrant who hides behind a rule book, do you take the high road and hope karma does the rest? Or do you burn their castle to the ground to save the village? I know what I did. And looking at the photos of that park, seeing the kids playing where my heartbreak used to be, I think I can live with it. But I'll never look at a rule book the same way again. Stay vigilant, folks, and check your bylaws. You never know who's reading them with a ruler in their glove box. Let me know in the comments, was I too harsh, or did Patricia get exactly what she ordered? I'll be reading.